Welcome, traveler. My name is Declan and I'm pleased to offer you the second part of the WoW Player's Diary. It will be a story about my first days in Azeroth. Learning from my EverQuest 2 experience, I knew that choosing a character class and server was something that needed careful thought. To get things moving, I reached out Igor Boyko, chief editor of Navigator of Game World magazine. He said that he was no longer playing, but he did give me the contact info, the man WoW expert Dima Romel. Dima was truly fan game at that time, and he regularly published Azeroth Chronicles, describing his adventures of his troll hunter Rasula. Dima advised me to go with either a warlock or a hunter. Being a big fan of shooter games, I felt like the hunter was a perfect fit. The questions of race was resolved even quicker. I'd always had a fondness for dwarfs, even since reading the Lord of the Rings. Regarding the server choice, Dima suggested joining a role-playing playroom, explaining that the people there are more decent. He meant that there were fewer griefers and that the role-playing aspects added an extra layer of interest to the game. He himself had played characters on role-playing servers. At the end of the day, I chose Moonglade server, which became my virtual home for the next year and a half. So, that evening, that I was finally ready to dive into the World of Warcraft, all the major pieces were in place. I created my account, activated the timecard code, and installed the game. Of course, there was a hefty download of about a gigabyte of updates, since the disc only contained the basic version without patches. My first character, just as planned, was a dwarf hunter with a prominent hooked nose and thick mane of black hair. My favorite nickname for computer game characters, Gatekeeper, was already taken. After a moment of thought, I decided on Dravosek, Russian word for woodcutter. Back then, dwarves and gnomes began their adventures in the snowy Coldridge Valley. The fir tree-covered mountain valley immediately captivated me. I was being drawn to those kind of locations in games. I spent my first couple of evenings exploring the valley, doing quests and just taking it all in. Yes, I'd seen plenty of screenshots, but nothing could compare with experience at first hand. The first big win for the game was its vibrant and emotional visuals. The colors could sometimes be a bit too acidic, but for the most part they were striking from the first moment of the game and left a lasting impression. The second big plus was the game loading speed. It took about 30-40 seconds from clicking the icon to seeing my character in the game world. EverQuest 2 felt like ages in comparison, taking 2 or 3 minutes. What's more, WoW had a seamless world. You didn't have to sit through loading screens every time you moved from one area to the next. In EverQuest, loading a new location would take around 1.5 or maybe 2 minutes. Well, naturally, staring at loading screen wasn't all the fun, especially when I only had an hour and a half set aside for gaming at the evening. The Coldridge Valley is like a nearby zone where newly created characters all hang out. I spent a couple of evenings where until I finally decided it was a time to venture into the big world. The journey began through a tunnel leading to Morogh. There I had a run-in with a Throg that almost got the better of me. Emerging from tunnel, I found myself on the road to Karanas. The run went without a hitch, and soon I arrived in the first town, which consisted just a tavern and a forge facing each other. However, Drosek's life proved to be short. After exploring the world, playing for a few evenings, I looked at a character from a new perspective, and I realized I just didn't like his appearance. And the name didn't feel right either, well, too Russian somehow. It wasn't that I was ashamed of it, but I decided that I needed something more original. The name Declan had been kicking around in my head since the early 90s. Originally that was a name for one of my main characters in the fantasy novel. I liked the way it sounded, short, catchy and, well, original. As it turned out later, the shortened version deck also sounded pretty cool, so English-speaking players playing on both deck of cards and deck of the ship. This time I put more effort into crafting my character appearance, resulting in a bearded, bald dwarf with a Ukrainian Cossack oscillated, it's a single long forelock. Declan would become my main character for the next 4.5 years in the game. I had to go through the leveling grind again with this new character reaching Karanas once more. The initial euphoria of being in Azeroth, oh finally I'm here, began to fade and familiar issues started to surface. I was fed up with quests like kill 20 reds, bring tails in EverQuest 2. Well, these were back and in no smaller quantity. The leveling process was also hampered by several challenges related to hunter mechanics. Back then, hunter got their pets at level 10 after completing a quest. I wasn't very skilled at kiting yet, I'd only learned that in Outland, so I often had to engage mobs in close quarters combat. The mobs hit hard, but I not so much. It wasn't until Cataclysm and beyond that creatures began to fail with a simple hit. In the late Burning Crusade days, a careless player who pulled a pack of mobs risked a heroic death. And in 1-1 fight you could easily get beaten, especially as a noob hunter. What's more, the primary resource for hunter at that time was mana, not focus, meaning that after just 1 or 2 fights you had to stop for food and water, further slowing down the leveling process. And if a pull went wrong, it was a run back from the graveyard. Getting a pet after the quest made things more fun, but leveling was still going slow. There were no heirloom items either, those wouldn't appear until the Wrath of the Lich King expansion. Nor were there any guild bonuses, where the first mount was given at level 40 and cost a hefty 70 gold. Before that you had to travel everywhere by feet. And then were the questing problems. I wouldn't find out about Quest Helper until April, or that add-ons even existed. So I often found myself running in circles searching for targets to complete quests. The interface at that time didn't even highlight the mobs that needed their ears or tails removed. Yes, despite the challenges, the pros still overweighed the cons. Again, compared to the EverQuest 2, which was still fresh in my memory, there were a number of things that made WoW much better. First, there were no death penalties. In EverQuest 2, dying meant a loss of experience, setting your character back a bit in the leveling process. In WoW, there were no such penalties, and since I died quite frequently in those early days, just as I had in EverQuest 2, this lack of consequence was incredibly welcome. Then were the intuitive class mechanics and the item parameter system. EverQuest 2 had tons of parameters on its items, but I never really understood what they did or how they worked. In WoW, everything was straightforward. A green item was better than a white one, and a blue item was better than a green one. For a hunter, agility was a key stat, shields were necessary, and you needed to shoot with a bow. I only learned about rotations and other tricks later on when I started venturing into dungeons. Crafting and earning gold were other points of contrast. Both were major struggles for me in EverQuest 2. So in WoW I decided to skip producing professions altogether. Morogh advised me against it at first, suggesting that I should get acquainted with the game first to understand how things worked. And at the end I opted for mining and skinning. The gold wasn't exactly flowing like a river, but it was enough to upgrade my skills and buy blue quality gear from the auction house. The cartoon graphics were another key factor. Graphics in games were a tricky subject. Since the early 19th, computer games had gone from primitive and sometimes schematic visuals to photorealistic graphics. I hadn't decided what I preferred myself. On one hand, more details meant a more beautiful picture, of course. On the other hand, the movements of computer characters and environment always hinted at their artificiality. In contrast, An intentionally exaggerated style ironically made a better impression. WoW's signature cartoonish look, rather than EverQuest 2 realism, won me over. Last, but certainly not least, was the lore. I had made several attempts to dig into the history of Morogh, the world of EverQuest, but I could never find any useful resources. There were some basic materials, but nothing that truly helped me to understand, even in broad strokes, what was happening. Azeroth, on the other hand, wasn't an entirely unfamiliar place. While I wasn't an expert on Azerothian history by any means back then, I had a general sense of the setting. All these positive elements, combined with the captivating visuals and the sheer joy of immersing myself in a long-loved universe, all play their part. When I left EverQuest 2 for WoW, I told the guys from Exorcist Guild that I'd be back in a couple of months. I even remember writing them a letter from foreign land in which I described my first days in Azeroth. I couldn't have been more wrong. By the end of my first months, it became clear that I was here for good and for a long haul.